I'm Lisa Shepard, and I am the Executive Director of the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. The mission of the CJCP is to enhance professionalism among North Carolina lawyers, judges, and law students, a mission which it has been doing since 1998. One of the ways that the CJCP does this is to sponsor this historical video series, which is a collection of video interviews of distinguished lawyers, judges, and professionals from across North Carolina. The CJCP began filming these video interviews in 2000 as a means to preserve the thoughts of these bar leaders on the legal profession and on professionalism issues. All of the videos in this series are available to you on the CJCP website and the CJCP's dedicated YouTube channel. We are so fortunate to have had many distinguished members of the North Carolina Bar over the years, and they have much accumulated wisdom to share with us. It is important to understand that the practice of law is a profession, and doing it well requires not only substantive knowledge that one gains in law school and from studying for the bar exam, but also the value of experience learned from other lawyers. I hope that this video series will give you not only a fresh insight into the person being interviewed, but also some meaningful information about how to be a better lawyer in your own practice. Enjoy, and remember, esse quam videri. Strive to be professional in all that you do, rather than to merely seem so.
Hello, my name is Tom Ross, and it's my pleasure and honor today to interview former Chief Justice Henry Frye for the Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. Chief, I think I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little about growing up in Ellerbe, North Carolina, and what impact that might have had on the ultimate direction of your career.
Perhaps I should say I grew up on the outskirts of Ellerbe, a little farm south of Ellerbe. Ellerbe is a nice-sized town with one stoplight and one caution light. I grew up on the farm, and one of the things about growing up on the farm is you learn to work, and you learn the work ethic and the importance of work, and so I suppose that would be the first thing that I would say. The second one is that I came from a large family. There were 12 of us, 6 boys, 6 girls. And so we learned to share things. We learned to get along with each other. We learned at times that we had to sort of fight for what we wanted. And so that would be another one, I suppose. I guess the third thing that I would refer to is that living out on the farm in the country, blacks and whites lived across the road from each other, and there was a lot of association between black and white, and we worked together on the farm and tobacco and things of that nature. And the boys would go to the tobacco barn at night when we were curing the tobacco, and you barely knew the difference until the weekend, at which time we sort of were in our shell, so to speak. They were in their shell, 2 separate worlds completely. And it was just a different thing on the weekend. We went different ways, and there was no contact whatsoever. And that was an interesting phenomenon.
So during the early years when you were growing up, a lot of people who grew up on farms, education wasn't a high priority. What influenced you to be interested in education and think about going to college and ultimately to law school?
I think it was a combination of things. All of us went to the same school. And we had a great principal who preached to us almost all of the time about things and about what we should do and trying to get an education. And I recall his thing, winners never quit and quitters never win. That was one of his favorite stories. And then I had a scoutmaster who was also our basketball coach, who was just a great guy who influenced me quite a bit. And then there was my English teacher, Mrs. Easterling, who talked about the importance of doing things and being the best you could be. And so all of that had a lot to do with my interest in going on to school and so forth.
And I guess that probably out of your high school class, not that many kids did go on to college, but you chose to pursue a higher education. And tell us about how you reached that decision and why you chose the university that you chose, and sort of what that transition was like from the small town in Ellerbe to a larger place with
Yes.
a university.
I probably should mention that during growing up in Ellerbe, we had, among other things, agriculture. And in those days, we had the New Farmers of America, which were the black students. And at the white schools, they had the Future Farmers of America. The Future Farmers of America had their conventions, their major convention in Raleigh at what then we called it State College. The black students had theirs at North Carolina A&T State University. Two separate worlds, and so I had been to A&T participating in oratorical contests and things of that nature with the New Farmers of America, the NFA as we referred to it. So I liked A&T, and that had a lot to do with the fact that that's where I started. Now I did think about a lot of other colleges and universities, but again in those days blacks went to black schools and whites went to the white schools. So in North Carolina, at least, I was limited. I was telling folks the other day that I wrote for bulletins. In those days, you would write for the bulletin of the various schools. And so I had a lot of nerve. I wrote and got the bulletin from Harvard University. I didn't have the slightest idea I was going there, but I said, why not? So all of those things had a lot to do with it. But I think the fact that I had spent time at A&T and liked it had a lot to do with my going to North Carolina A&T State University. It was in A&T College, of course.
I've heard you talk before about what it was like to come to the recognition that not all people of color were allowed the same privileges as others, and particularly in the area of participating in government, voting, and that sort of thing. Talk to us about how that formed your views of society and what impact that had on you.
Well, I need about an hour and a half to really do, that. But as I indicated, we were separate in almost all things that we did, and blacks had difficulty registering to vote. Later on, I had difficulty but this was much later in my life because this was after I had finished college and had served in the United States Air Force in Japan and Korea, and came back to North Carolina, to Ellerbe, to register to vote, and I couldn't pass the literacy test.
That was after you'd gotten out of college?
Yes, this is after I'd gotten out of college, and after I was a second lieutenant and first lieutenant in the United States Air Force. But the kinds of questions that the person asked me were questions that I couldn't answer. And they were intended to be that way. But luckily, later on, I went to see the chair of the Board of Elections for the county. And he apologized. And the next time I went back to register, they had a new registrar. And I didn't have any real problem registering at that time. So that was one of the examples of the type of thing that we had. And as far as blacks, there were no blacks in the legislature, no blacks as city councilmen that I knew anything about or anything of that nature. So blacks just were not a part of the actual decision-making process for the government of North Carolina.
Was it that attempt to go register and vote, or that plus lots of other things? What was it that caused you to want to go to law school?
It was a combination. I was really going to be a dentist, but I really wasn't positive. I had a background in biology and chemistry and air science, and I think what really was the turning point was that I could not get into University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill dental school at that time. The statement was that I needed 2 more courses in physical chemistry, and that the earliest I could get in would have been about 15 months later. And I came back and talked with another lawyer, a black lawyer, Kenneth Lee, who was from Hamlet, North Carolina, and who was a graduate of the University of North Carolina Law School. And we discussed it and talked about it, and he said, Henry said, that's what you ought to do. And I did. And I'd like to say that I went to the law school a little hesitant because of my background in terms of whether I would be qualified to enter the University of North Carolina Law School. And the person who looked at it said, well, I think you'd be okay. Said you'll have to pass the SAT, and not SAT, LSAT, right. And I think what impressed me was that I was in Greensboro at that time. I came back to Greensboro that day, and the next day I had a letter in the mail from the law school thanking me for coming down and telling me what I needed to do and telling me when the LSAT would be taken and things of that nature. And I felt good about that, you know, that maybe they want me to come and be a part of the law school.
So was it a good decision to go to law school?
It was the right decision for me, and with apologies to my dentist, every time I go to him, and he starts fumbling around in my mouth, I said, boy, I'm glad I went to law school. So I think I made the right decision. I feel good about it.
There were how many blacks in your law school class?
That was it.
You were it. So yes. Talk to us about
by
how
the way,
that feeling was.
By the way, there was only one woman that graduated with me at the law school, and she later became the librarian at the Supreme Court of North Carolina.
Really?
So I was on the court as an associate justice at that time, and she was she was the librarian. I thought that was an interesting historical fact. But by the time I went to law school, first of all, I was married, and social things just weren't my concern. My concern, I was living in Greensboro most of the time and driving back and forth, and so my concern was to get my work and get my degree and get out of there. And so I wasn't worried about the social things, so somebody else will have to talk about that for the most part, except for one event that the class was having. And they were going to have it at some particular place, and the question was whether I could go. And to tell you the truth, I've forgotten exactly what happened in reference to that. But there were still the separate but, quote, equal things in a lot of situations, even in those days, because this was prior to the Civil Rights Acts that changed those things. But my classes were good. Luckily, the first exam I took, I made an A on it. And in those days, we used numbers so that nobody would know what name went with the numbers. But somehow, everybody tended to find out who made the A's in the class. And I think that gave me some respect among the class. And generally, I had no real problems there.
So, after law school, as a young lawyer then, and married, and you'd been living in Greensboro, I guess, since you came back from the military. Is that correct?
Essentially, yes. I spent a few months in New York, but essentially I moved to Greensboro.
And to tell me about what your first effort was to try to locate a job and move into the legal community in Greensboro.
Well, I finished in 1959. I recall some recruiters came to the campus, and I recall the one offer that I had was to go with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation at a salary of $5,000 and some a year. And as I looked at that and decided that I didn't think I wanted to do that. I really wanted to practice law in North Carolina. I had no offers from any law firm or anything of that nature, and so I decided to go out and try it on my own. And so that's what I did. But again, I opened my office in a building with two other lawyers, J. Kenneth Lee, the same person who had encouraged me to go to law school, and Major High. I don't recall whether Major High was there or came later, but at any rate, I think the thing that I'm impressed by that was that Kenneth Lee told me that I could use his secretary until I could afford to hire a secretary of my own. And the secretary that he had was someone who'd been with him a long time. She was very good and that type of thing. And so that helped me a great deal. Also, I recall that one of my first cases that Kenneth sent the case to me was a person who was buying some property. And I remember that before I could talk to the person, he called me and told me what to ask and what to charge and the kinds of questions this person was probably going to ask me and what my responses should be and things of that nature. And so when the client came in, I mean, I felt real good, you know, that I knew what to ask and what to do, because in law school then, you didn't have any practical courses, but you didn't know what to do. You know, client comes in, you look around, you say, what do you do? But he helped me a great deal in things of that nature. And eventually, after a while, I moved my office out on my own, and I thought I was moving along rather nicely.
Kenneth Lee was a mentor for you.
Yes.
Were there other mentors in the early stages of your career that played an important role?
Interestingly enough, there weren't a lot of black lawyers in North Carolina, and so I got to know all of them. So anytime I went to any city in North Carolina where there was a black lawyer, I went to his office first. And I would do that before I would go to the courthouse or to the particular place, that business where I was to go, because I wanted to find out what we call the lay of the land. You know, how was I going to be treated? Was anything in particular that I need to look out for and be sure that I don't say or don't do, and any suggestions that person might have. And I think that was pretty constant among the black lawyers, at least in North Carolina at that time. And so we always made it a habit of checking with that particular lawyer before we did anything really in that particular area.
So as you began your law practice and were in Greensboro and got involved in the community in various ways, tell us what some of the community involvements were and how you chose them.
How I chose them is maybe a little difficult question, but a lot of it had to do with associations. I went by Hayes Taylor YMCA, and that was an place where young boys, primarily at that time, participated in various sports and things of that nature. And again, we had at that time 2 YMCAs, one downtown for whites, and then this one in the black community, the Hayes Taylor for blacks. And so I got started working with them and helping with their campaigns to raise money and things of that nature, and attending their annual meetings, where I got to meet a lot of people. And interestingly, some of the major corporate heads actually came to the Hayes Taylor annual meeting. People who know the area would know people like Caesar Cone, probably, and like that. But at any rate, I was a sole practitioner, and spent a good part of my time trying to make a living. Right. And I guess after about 2.5 years or so was when I got the call to join the United States Attorney's Office as an assistant United States attorney. So I had to give up my practice and start acting, representing the United States. I kind of like that, you know. I liked being able to stand up and say, may it please the court, my name is Henry Frye, and I represent the United States of America, and our position on this matter is. That was a big thing in those days, because again, we had no black in North Carolina that was in that type of position. And but the appointment was made by Kennedy, who was Attorney General at that time. And I had a good experience there, representing the United States.
How do you, before you get into that piece of your life, I'm interested in knowing, were you already a member of the Greensboro Bar Association then, at the time you were appointed U.S. Attorney, or Did that occur
I
afterwards?
believe it occurred after that.
Had you tried to join before then?
I had inquired, but I had not pushed it. At that time, there were no black members, and I understand that there was some opposition to blacks becoming members. But 2 or 3 people that I know of had a lot to do with the fact that I was eventually admitted to the Bar Association. Jack Elam, who signed my application, as I recalled, and Herman Amasa Smith, who was the clerk, I believe, of the federal court at that particular time, and I don't know who else, but at that time there had been no blacks in the Greensboro Bar Association, and I've forgotten now what the story was, but the story in the paper about my being admitted to the Bar Association. But prior to that, the Forsyth County Bar had admitted Richard Irwin, who later became a federal district court judge, and he was black. So Greensboro was a little behind Winston-Salem in terms of making that change.
But the Middle District was ahead of many districts when you became a U.S. attorney.
Yes.
How many other African Americans were U.S. attorneys in the country at that point?
Probably 4 or 5 throughout the country, but none others in North Carolina. And when I was appointed, one of the big questions people were asking was, where was I going to eat when I moved about the district with the court? Because we met, among other places, in Wilkesboro, in Salisbury, in Durham, in Rockingham, and several other places. So again, here I was, standing in court representing the United States of America, and couldn't eat in the front door and at the seats, the counters, for some of the places where we were actually holding court. So that was it was unpleasant in that sense. But I knew what the situation was, and so I didn't let that bother me.
Once you became U.S. attorney, how did it change the way others perceived you, both in the black community and in the white community?
I think to a lot of them, I was, I guess, a celebrity. Everywhere I went, I either was congratulated, people turned their head one way or the other. And I got a lot of invitations to speak at various places and to come and talk to people and things of that nature. So it was big news at that particular time.
How, in your opinion, were you selected by the president? I mean, what had you been involved in the past? Who were people that helped you in terms of obtaining that appointment?
Yeah, I think probably the single most important person was a gentleman named John Wheeler, who was president of Mechanics and Farmers Bank in Durham. He was a very active Democrat at that particular time, and he was very politically astute. And I think the Democratic administration in Washington at that time relied to a large extent on him for who would be a good person to handle the particular job. And I had done some work in association with Mr. Wheeler, and I think he respected my work. And based on that, I would think that that's why he recommended me for the position.
And you served in that position for 4 years?
No, I think it was less than 3 years. And then I got an offer to teach at North Carolina Central Law School. And I thought that would be a good opportunity to transition into the practice of law, because that's really what I wanted to do, was practice law. And at that time, I didn't think I had much of a chance of ever becoming the United States attorney. And so I had, about after 2.5 years, I was about ready to leave the U.S. Attorney's Office anyway. And so they made this offer for me to come down and teach at North Carolina Central Law School, and I accepted and really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed teaching.
And how long were you on the faculty there?
2 years. I taught for 2 years. My second year, in the spring, I decided to run for the legislature, and one of my law student classes paid my filing fee, which was $17.50. So they gathered up the money and they said, "We'll pay your filing fee." So they paid my filing fee, and I ran for the House of Representatives. And at that time, no black had been elected in 66 years to the North Carolina legislature. And guess what? I lost.
And those were at-large elections. There
Yes,
were
they were
not any
at-large.
kind of districts back in those days.
No.
Everything was at large.
Yeah. In Guilford County, we were electing 6 at that time.
Right. And what year was that?
This would have been 1966, and I was 7th, and so I missed the cut.
But then you came back in 1968.
Then in 1968, I came back and ran again, and this time I won. And so to Raleigh I went. And actually I was elected in 68. The legislature session really started in 1969. So it was in 1969 that for the first time in the 20th century, when little children came to the legislature from all over the state, they could see a dark face among all of the people who were in the legislature. That was in the House. They still didn't have anybody in the Senate. But
until you came along a little later.
Well, no, actually we had some other blacks in the Senate before I came over there. Yes.
How long did you serve in the House?
I served 6 terms, which would have been 12 years in the House, and then I ran for the Senate and won, and served 1 term in the Senate.
And what was it like coming into the State House as a member in 1968 and being the only person of color?
Well, the first thing was it was something different, something new. It was something newsworthy, and so we get all that out of the way first. The second thing was a good feeling that here I am now a part of the people who make the laws for the state of North Carolina. And of course, as a lawyer, you've learned to respect the law, and wonder why laws are made one way or the other. Well, now here I am a part of that process, and so I guess I was probably the most studious person in the entire House of Representatives, because I didn't know any better at that time. I would read everything in the bill. I mean, they would introduce 25 bills, and I'd stay up late at night, reading everything in the bill and studying it and trying to decide what it meant and what it didn't mean and what I could do. And so
you were the only one doing that, I bet.
Well, there may have been a few other freshmen like me who were doing the same thing, But after being there a while, I learned that you have to sort of try to get the heart of it and let the committees, each committee decide, first of all, about the details. And then you look at it very closely when it comes to the House floor for a vote, as it comes from the committee. But it took me a little while to really learn that. But it was a great experience. One of the things that I think is worthy of note is that I had a lot of respect from a lot of legislators throughout the state, especially in those areas where there were large numbers of blacks. And we had black people from all over the state who came to see me sort of as their representative. And almost invariably the position I would take, well, who is your representative? And some of them knew and some of them did not. And in each case, I would say, well, hold on just a minute, and I would call that particular legislator and tell him that I had someone from his district here, and I'd like to bring the person down to meet him. or in some cases to see them because they already knew them. And so I would take that person to his legislator, and then after introducing them or talking a little bit, I would come on back and deal with whatever else I had to deal with. And I got to meet a lot of people from throughout the state like that, but hopefully I helped them to realize that you need to work with the people from your district where you have a vote and where you can influence whether they are elected or re-elected, as the case may be. And of course, the legislators already knew that, so I didn't have to explain that to them. But it was a very interesting process, and some very interesting years while I was there.
And you, as you pointed out, the first time you ran, you were 7th out of 6 for 6 positions. There were times when you finished first among all the people running in this large district.
Yes, that happened, I think, twice. May have been 3 times. I don't even remember how many times, but it did happen a few times. I don't know how much we want to get into the political system, but there was, in those days when you had 6 people, for example, running, you could vote for 6, or you could vote for 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1. Well, a lot of blacks voted for 1, and that was me, you know. And so that tended to push me higher on the list, not high enough the first time to make up for the fact that I was way down in several of the predominantly white districts, you see. But starting in '68, that together with that large number of votes that I got in other areas, again, in probably less than a majority was I in the top group, or near the top. I would be more like 5th or 6th or something like that, and sometimes even 7th. But with that big vote in the black community, that would push me up much higher.
But over the years, you built up significant support in the white community.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Then it was 1980 when you ran for the Senate. Is that right?
Yes.
And served 1 term there.
Yes.
And then something happened that caused you maybe to think about leaving the Senate.
Well, let me tell you the real story.
Okay.
Trying to practice law, and at that time I had organized a little bank and working with that and working in the community and trying to help raise 2 sons, and the legislative work and all of that together was putting a strain on me and my family in a way. And it also hurt financially, and I had a lot of credit cards with a lot of bills and so forth on it. And so I decided that I would leave the Senate and come back to Greensboro full time and practice law for a few years and pay off all my bills and things of that nature, and then decide whether I would run for a statewide office. That's the real story, okay? So I announced that I would not run again, and then after the term ended, I got this call from the governor saying that Phil Carlton, who was on the Supreme Court, would be announcing his retirement from the court, and he wanted to appoint me to the Supreme Court. And so I had to make up my mind as to whether to go on the court rather than to finish paying for my bills right then, that type of thing, yes.
And that wasn't an easy decision for you, was it?
No, it was not. As a matter of fact, I told him that I needed to think about it, and people who know Governor Hunt will understand. He said, well, you think about it and talk to your family tonight. Don't talk to anybody else, please, and call me before breakfast in the morning.
Right.
So I did that, and one of my sons was a little reluctant about it, but the other one sort of thought maybe yes, and my wife thought yes, and so we talked about it and said, well, this is something that you just can't pass up, you know. So the next morning I called him before breakfast and said, Governor, yes, I accept. And I said it'll take me a few months to close out my law practice. He said, well, court, this was in January, about the 19th, I guess. He said, well, the court meets February the 3rd or something like that, and said, I'd like for you to be on the bench when the court meets in February. I said, Governor, there's no way I can close out a practice for all of these years. He said, well, you see if you can't work that out. See if I believe you can do it if you can work this. Anyway, make a long story short. So I'm right back in my same rut, you know, trying to close out cases and everything, and working on the weekends, trying to do it at the same time, reading all those opinions. But somehow I got through it, and well, that's the story.
And sworn in as the first African American member of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
So another in a long line of firsts that you've established in North Carolina. And each time you've had to go into an environment in which there's been a lot of publicity, a lot of, as you said earlier, celebrity status, but also a lot of pressure to be the first African American and to be different than the other people that are sitting there and to change the dynamics of an institution. How did that work when you went to the court?
Well, I guess history will have to record how it really worked. First of all, I don't accept anything that I don't think I can handle. And I thought that I was well qualified to go on the court and to be a member of that court. I had served in the legislature. I had served as a prosecuting attorney. I had taught law, and I had practiced law in just a variety of things. So I had experiences that other members of the court had, but I had some experiences that I thought that none of them had had before. And so I thought I brought something to the court. And I tried to do the best I could to look at things objectively, but your background has a little something to do with the way you look at what happened in the courtroom. And having been in that courtroom on both sides, prosecuting and defending, sometimes I had a better feel for that than some of the other members of the court. And so that's what I brought to the court, and I think I handled it well. History will say whether I did or did not.
I think most of us believe you handled it quite well. It's interesting to think about your career and the decisions that you've made. And once you were on the court, having reached not only the State House, but the State Senate, and now a justice on the Supreme Court, there was, I'm sure, temptation to take a run at that statewide office, other than, of course, being elected to the Supreme Court, which is a statewide office in and of itself. But in listening to you talk today and knowing you as I do, the law has been a very important part of your life. You beam when you talk about representing the United States, and it's been important to you to be part of the legislature, to make the laws, and to be on the court where you served with great distinction for, I guess, just a little shy of 18 years. What kept you there? What is it about the law and about the court, about the judiciary that you loved? Well,
procedurally, I liked the court with oral arguments and things of that nature. I guess what I liked was being able to write an opinion or to influence an opinion to decide the law the way that I thought the law was. In other words, to get to the real heart. For example, when we are interpreting a law passed by the legislature, what does that law mean? Well, the words on the paper sometimes don't convey clearly what it means. So that's where the experience of the justices comes to play, to say, well, now, what does this really mean? And we're trying to say really what the legislature meant when it said it. But having been in the legislature, I knew that sometimes even the legislators didn't know what they were doing. And I knew that sometimes the people who were sponsoring the bills had one thing in mind, and some of us who voted for it had something else in mind. So I think all of that sort of fit into my feeling good about being able to have a feel for what to write and how to interpret things and how to give meaning to the law as it was written by the legislature, or the constitutional provisions, and things of that nature. And some of the matters that came were things that I had something to do with, in terms of voting for or against a particular law or something. But my rationale always was that it's not what I might have thought, but what is there passed by the legislature. And let's try to, if we can, get that meaning. And that was an exciting part of it. Now, I have to tell you that was great. But I really enjoyed going throughout the state and talking to people about our government and the three branches of government, and how the one group is to make the law, another is to see that it's executed, and then the third branch is to try to interpret that law, try to resolve disputes between people, and try to get people to see that role, and especially talking to young people, children in schools and things like that. I really enjoyed that. And so I was able to do my work and at the same time be able to do some other things that I enjoyed probably even better than having to resolve disputes in the court system.
You, as I've said before in our discussion today, have been the first of a lot of things. In 1999, you reached yet another first, and became the first African American Chief Justice, and a remarkable feat in and of itself. What some would say is the cap on a remarkable career. I'm not sure that's the cap yet myself, but what did it feel like to be in the old House chambers or Senate chambers, whichever it was, in the Capitol, and take the oath as the Chief Justice of North Carolina?
I felt good about North Carolina, and I said, well, I think we're making progress in North Carolina. I have to add that in appointing me to the position, the governor was following tradition, and the tradition was to appoint the most senior member of the court as Chief Justice. And the governor followed that tradition because I was the most senior member of the court at that particular time. But to take that oath and think about the day that I couldn't pass a literacy test, and to think about the day that I introduced a bill in the legislature to abolish the literacy test as a requirement for voting, and people said that there was no chance the bill would ever get through the House, or if it did, they would kill it in the Senate. And of course the bill passed the House and passed the Senate. And to think about just the history of North Carolina made me realize that here I am in a position, hopefully, to influence the court system throughout North Carolina and to make some needed changes that needed to be made. And so it was a very good feeling.
Looking back over your career, and all the different things in which you've been involved, and clearly you have been in the position to be a role model for a lot of people. And I know personally for a lot of people that both black and white. Tell me how you've tried to live as a lawyer, and what qualities you've tried to exhibit as a lawyer that you think have made people look up to you and have made you a role model to other people.
Those are good questions. I'm not sure what the answer is. First of all, I believe in the law, and I believe that if properly interpreted and properly handled, that's the way to run a society. And so in the practice of law, I've tried to respect the law. I've tried to respect the court system, I've tried to respect the judge who is presiding in a particular case, even though I disagree with him on things. As Chief Justice, I tried to be fair in terms of looking at the whole system and that type of thing. But I think the other thing that maybe people may have noticed is that I tried to explain to people, this is the way things are. This is the way we operate. Now, you have a role in this. And whatever that role is, if everybody will do his part or her part, whether it's just voting, whether it's educating people about voting, whether it's learning about the process that operates, whatever it is, if all of us will participate, that we'll have a better society. And one of the things that I talked about a lot was jury duty. And I told people on several occasions that people said, how can I get out of jury duty? I said, I'm not going to tell you. I said, I'll tell you how you can maybe get a postponement if you have a good reason. I said, but I don't want to tell you how to get out of jury duty. I want you to be a juror. I want you to come in and be a part of this system to make it work. I said, if good people don't come and serve as jurors, who are we going to get to serve? You know, and so I think this type of approach that some people may have seen that it's real, and that I mean what I say. And of course, I've tried to follow the law myself and abide by it and that type of thing. So I think all of that may have had some bearing on it.
Chief, it's been an incredible pleasure to talk to you. The last question I want to ask you today is what are you most proud of? What accomplishment, what action, what part of your life, the way you've lived it, makes you most proud?
I could name a lot, but I'm going to surprise you with two things. The first one is being chosen and having the honor to speak for commencement for Grimsley High School when my son Harlan was in the graduating class and a member of the basketball team, and to be able to talk to those students. Okay. The second one was being able to administer the oath to my son, Henry Frye Jr., as a Superior Court judge. And aside from just the personal pleasure of those occasions, was the fact that I feel good about both of their development. And one of the problems with people in public office who are very busy doing so many things is that sometimes our children are left out and go astray. And so I guess mine is, I think that my wife Shirley and I somehow have managed to set a good example for them. And I feel good about that.
And that third thing was marrying Shirley Frye.
Well, okay.
Who is responsible for you and your children as anybody, wouldn't you agree?
I would agree, and probably more responsible than anyone else.
A remarkable person in her own right.
Yeah.
Chief, it's a pleasure, and thank you for this time that you've spent with us. And more importantly, thank you for what you've done and meant to North Carolina and to the legal profession, to the judiciary, and to those of us who admire you so much.
Thank you very much.